Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, and it is my pleasure to have with us today Joel Beal. Joel is the CEO and co-founder of Alloy. Alloy is a platform that aggregates and analyzes information from all sources in the supply chain, providing insight and visibility into consumer demand. They can tell you what, when, and how much stock you need, so you don't have to guess. They basically joined companies like Google, IBM, Microsoft, and SAP in being named as a best-in-class provider in the Consumer Goods Technology magazine's 19th annual awards. They were basically top 10 vendor for both the artificial intelligence and supply chain planning business functions. They recently closed a 12 million Series A round for their artificial intelligence-powered supply chain platform, which brought their total funding to 15.3 million. They currently have offices in San Francisco, Vancouver, and Berlin. And I'm very excited to have Joel with us today to share more about himself and about the company. Joel, welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Excellent. So I'd like to start with yourself first, right? Because and I got this quote, and my team got this quote from you saying that your career has really been spent building big data platforms in lots of different spaces, starting in retail, moving over into financial technology, now with Alloy. But for you, it's all about the challenge of how do you connect things, how do you connect disparate data systems that sit across a lot of different companies, and that's what you're saying, that's at the core of what you try to do at Alloy as well. I'd love to maybe get you to share a little bit with us how you started your career in this, what drove your passion for data and for technology, and just a little bit about your background in general.
Yeah, so I initially came out to the San Francisco Bay Area a little over a decade ago as a graduate student studying economics. And so definitely had, at least from an academic standpoint, a lot of interest in how firms operated, how they could do so more efficiently, and was doing a lot of applied statistics on data sets. And I eventually transferred over into the private sector. There was just so much exciting stuff happening in technology that I just felt that there was more opportunity, and was able to start working, as you mentioned, with large retailers to start with in kind of a data science capacity, helping them understand how they could operate more efficiently with data sets that I would have drooled over as a graduate student. And it's in tackling that problem, I think you just see so much opportunity for companies to operate more efficiently. The data is there. It's a question of how do you kind of unleash it and help you make better decisions. And I think that's true, certainly in supply chain, where there's so many companies that are trying to coordinate. I think the problem is particularly acute here, but it's true in other industries as well. So, was able to work in the retail industry for a while, switched over, as I mentioned, into financial technology, found that there were a lot of similar patterns. And I, worked with a number of engineers who became my co-founders, and we had solved this a couple times, and we felt like this was a space that was just right for it.
Yes, I mean it's fascinating. So basically you're from a technology data academia almost, and it's fascinating because we've actually had on the podcast Dhruv just a couple of podcasts ago, and he runs the company called Shibbob, and he also was from the academia, and then he kind of transitioned into the entrepreneurial world. So it's interesting that there seems to be some commonality, and it's also that level of how do we make it more practical, right? And how do we take this maybe sometimes theoretical problems and really apply it in day-to-day life? So interesting to hear your start. And let's go a little bit into Alloy. So Alloy is you describe it as a digital native company built for today's consumer and the way the consumers buy. And you've basically been inspired and want to tackle a $20 trillion consumer goods market, right? So you aim to equip brands with a modern technology platform to help them become more demand-driven, more complete, and to grow. Now, to get some practicality to that, right, and make it really tangible, maybe let's take an example. How are you solving a problem of one of your clients? Let's go and share with our audience some concrete case study.
Sure. So let me walk you through an example of something that happened over the holidays. In the consumer products kind of world, the November and December oftentimes, at least I guess in certain parts of the world, are a huge percentage of your sales, right, in certain categories. And as you mentioned, we're really trying to help companies become more demand driven. What does that mean? It means being able to respond super quickly as demand patterns change, and customers are pretty fickle, probably more so than they ever have been before. So we had recently started working with a large consumer electronics company. It's one I'm sure many people on this podcast probably own their products. And they were going into the holiday period and had shipped out a bunch of product to a major retailer. This is a new product introduction where you often have the least amount of kind of historical information about how this product's performing, what replenishment patterns look like. And so they had shipped this in, and they were getting the last set of orders for that holiday period were coming in. And what we were able to do, we were new at the company at this point in time, was to take a look at all those orders as they arrived and to make recommendations that it actually looked like they were underestimating the amount of product that they would need. And the key reason they were doing this, as we kind of drilled into the detail, is that the out of stock rate for this product was actually quite high. And that wasn't being factored into the retailer's own plan for how much product they needed to offer. So they were looking at, the historical pattern of how much was being purchased, not taking into account that, whatever it was, 20-25% of the locations were already out of stock. And we could project out and say, hey, if you don't act on this, your out of stock levels continue to increase. And in fact, the amount of money that they would have left on the table was many millions of dollars. And so that's the kind of, insights that we're trying to bring. It's just one small example to our customers of, okay, we're tying together, there's greater demand that was expected. It resulted in out of stocks. It's going to result in further out of stocks unless you make a series of adjustments and you take these things into account in your forecasting that ultimately neither the retailer nor our customer was doing at that point in time. So being able to highlight that, it's a win on both sides. Both the retailer and our customer win because they have the right amount of product and they're able to recover, many millions of dollars. One of the key things that happened is they made some adjustments. They didn't make all of it. And you could actually see where those adjustments were made, they did much better. Where they weren't, they actually saw those out of stock rates jump. So it was kind of maybe not the best form of validation. You hope that all the things are solved, but sometimes people can't resolve the issue, but then they get that validation of, wow, you really did forecast this was going to happen. And unfortunately it did.
Very interesting. Yeah. And then a lot of times the proof is in the pudding, and sometimes you do need to apply it for certain areas, and then you kind of get convinced, and then you want to apply it for the whole pie, right? Because you realize, holy cow, I could have made even more money. And I guess it works on the other side of the story as well, I guess, right? I mean, does it happen on the other equation where you overstock, like where you have too much stock, and because you're, again, maybe you're following historical data and people actually stopped buying at some point the product or stopped being so interested in the product, but you are kind of only forecasting and using the historical data, you keep producing it, even if your demand has gone down. I mean, it would work in that kind of consideration as well, I guess, right? You probably have case studies like that as well.
Absolutely. And I think the numbers that I've seen from various research is usually around 8% of revenue is lost from out of stocks and overstocks. And it's actually about 50-50 if you break it down. Out of stocks are clearly one that are probably on their face more painful because you're like, hey, we lost a customer sale, but overstocks, to your point, are just as damaging. I mean, it's a bunch of capital that's tied up in products now that you can't sell. You're going to have to discount probably to get rid of. And I think, when you turn on Alloy for that first time, you get a level of visibility that you've never had before. I mean, because it's looking at every single SKU, at every single location, across, the individual stores, the DCs, the fulfillment centers, further upstream, your warehouses, your manufacturing plants, if you were going that far back. And you often instantly kind of see like, oh man, yeah, we're totally stocked, but we have 80 weeks of supply of this product, and man, we're running out here. So we're trying to provide that, kind of that aha moment of, okay, there's a lot of rebalancing that can be done. And oftentimes the high level metrics might be okay. I mean, that's the other key thing. Somebody might look at their overall, in-stock percentage or weeks of supply that they're holding, and that number might feel fine, but you drill into it and you find all the examples where it's off. And these companies are operating at such scale that that's many, many millions of dollars in so many cases of opportunity.
Yes. And I was wondering, maybe to also give some examples, because I know that you work with quite a few industries. I mean, I think you started in the consumer goods. So I'm guessing you just mentioned consumer electronics. I'm guessing it's also a big market for you is fast moving consumer goods, right? Are there other industries where you've had a good level of success? I don't know. I mean, maybe we can share some other examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So our target customer today is going to be somebody that sells a consumer product across, and that can be consumer packaged goods, consumer electronics, apparel, footwear, kind of fashion, really kind of running the gamut. I think if you look at the top 10 biggest CPGs in the world, we currently work with 3 of them or so. So, I mean, we definitely work with a lot of very large, multinational companies. We also work with lots of up and coming startups. And that's actually pretty exciting for us to be able to see, kind of the largest companies in the world that have some of the best supply chains and are incredibly efficient and have lots of resources. And then the companies that are being started down the street from us that just released some new, consumer electronics product and are just going to market. So pretty wide range, but yeah, CPG, consumer electronics are our 2 biggest verticals today. The technology that we've developed is not specific to consumer products. And we do have some companies we work with outside of it that are in chemicals and other areas, but that's the market that we've really started to focus on just from a go-to-market perspective, because it's obviously a huge space and you got to kind of pick your beachhead.
No, I mean, for sure. I think this applies to across industries. Is just that low-hanging fruits in terms of how fast they move on the shelf. It's definitely the consumer industry, and it's not as often that people run out of cars in stock or stuff like that. And we got this question, and I think it's something on the mind of quite a few of our listeners. The question was in terms of the prerequisites that you need in order to make Alloy, to plug in basically Alloy right into a company, right? So you need a certain set of data or certain set of quality of data, or you need certain. I guess quality is the right word, right? Or certain maturity of the supply chain of the company, alignment of the supply chain. I'd love to maybe ask you or walk us through, what's your let's say that certain companies are very mature. You mentioned top 10 global consumer goods. They're very mature from their supply chain, but maybe some of them are not, right? So what's your prerequisites in terms of, okay, I can work with this client or I cannot?
Yeah, so this might be a little surprising, but the level of maturity of your supply chain is, at the end of the day, not super important for whether we work with someone or not. And as I was mentioning before, we work with companies that are, just coming to market, and maybe they've been selling direct to consumer on their own website. They're just starting to work with their first couple retailers and distributors. So they're very nascent and really learning this as they go. To the other end of the spectrum, companies that have been doing this for many decades and, have deep expertise. Where we tend to thrive the best is there's some level of complexity in this, right? You're working with multiple partners. And one of the strengths of our platform is, one of the reasons that you can kind of get it up and running quickly is we work with we build connectors into those partners, right? So those retailers, those distributors, those 3PLs, we already have in many cases connections with them. We can just start pulling data on your behalf. And so the bigger thing is just an attitude and a desire to be more data driven as a company. That's like the number one thing that we're looking for. We don't need a lot of IT help to get up and running. It's just, okay, do you have that kind of desire to use all of this external data in many cases that is available to you, but often underutilized? And, are you motivated to kind of put that to work for you? So that's what we're looking for. That tends to be the companies that adopt, or the business units within these companies that adopt earliest, are those that kind of see that vision and say, okay, I can move beyond the world I've been doing, in some cases for a long time. And if I can collect all this data together, I can operate at a much higher level than I've been doing before.
Interesting. So basically, even if it's, I'm trying to get my head around as well. So even if it's somebody that doesn't have, like, I don't know, maybe they're currently operating, and a lot of companies do, right, on Excels and spreadsheets and so on. Number one tool, the most advanced, artificial intelligence tool that there is out there. Even if they're using that, so basically you can come. I mean, Aldo can come in, and then you become. It's almost like you're there demand and forecasting and demand software. It's like you can become their, I don't know, and it's a combination of that and ERP. I mean, it's almost like I'm trying to I don't know what's the right term to use and what you stand for, but it's you offer them a suite of data-driven insights.
Yeah, and I think one of the key parts of that is, because sometimes we'll get this question, how are you different than an ERP? We're very different from an ERP. That's going to be collecting all that internal data that you have, and very operational in nature. We're helping you collect data from all your partners, right? The supply chain's a network. There are many companies that you're working with. They are sharing data back with you that you are probably handling in a pretty manual way. And so we're going to help you go collect all that. We're going to give you the tools to be able to analyze it and use it to make you a better partner, so you can operate more efficiently internally, but you can also operate as a better partner and help those external companies. So oftentimes people get started by just selecting a couple partners. You don't need to do everything at once. They'll say, hey, we just want to connect these set of partners. Let's see how it works. Let's see how this levels up the way that we operate. And then as we get those proof points, we move into other parts of the business. And I think that works really well with our business model, because we can turn these on very quickly. And so you can test, you can evaluate. You don't have to worry about, a super long-term implementation process. You can see that value, and you can use that to drive kind of, further investment versus making that massive investment up front.
Got you. So it's like, okay, I'm Procter & Gamble, just giving an example, and I just want to analyze how it works for my Walmart sales, right? Let's say, or Carrefour, or whatever supermarket in the world.
Exactly.
And basically, okay, let's deploy it for this, I don't know, just Texas, okay, or I don't know, California, and let's see how that works out. And if we're happy, then we'll go at scale, something like that, right? And then basically, if you succeed, then the clients give you more and more of their visibility and supply chain, which is interesting, actually, yeah, because it gives that flexibility. And that's a big bottleneck for a lot of, I don't want to name big software companies, but all this, whenever it comes to large implementations, that's a huge problem, because people don't want to all of a sudden, and there's been so many failed ones, right? And they don't want to take the risk, and they want pilots, or they want smaller types of proof of concepts, right? So I guess in that respect, it makes it very easy for a big company to use you guys, or for a small company. So that's great, actually. And I'd love also to see, how does it work with e-commerce, right? With Amazon, with Alibaba, with, all these platforms to sell online. I'm guessing you can plug in very easily into those as well.
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of the big value propositions you offer is, we're going to sync all of your e-commerce and your traditional, retail business. And so you can have one view of all of that, and you can overlay them in really neat ways, because you can get super geo-targeted and understanding that, these are areas where maybe I don't have a lot of traditional retail presence, but I have a lot of e-commerce sales. And so, hey, I can use that, to maybe drive, I should be in retail stores in that area. So e-commerce is certainly a big part of what we can bring in. There's a wealth of data available there, because that data tends to be more digitized and kind of ready to be consumed, and you can get it in more detail, whether that's being done first party, or it's being done through a third party like Amazon.
And how long does it take? How long does it take to deploy Alloy? I know that you have a few case studies listed on your website. I think this is a big question for a lot of for a lot of companies, especially the larger they are, the more they would ask you, how long and how complicated it is.
This is where I tend to get in trouble because I get prone to get excited. But, we signed a customer earlier today. They wanted to just start, and they were like, hey, as fast as you can, we want to get live with a major retailer. They'll be up and running and using our platform in 2 days, in that particular case. So it can be extremely fast. That's not always the case. The bigger companies, there tend to be more pieces of data they want to bring in. It can certainly be more lengthy, but I think one of the big trends I'm seeing happening in enterprise software is that speed of implementation is a bigger area of differentiation, right? And that's something we really pride ourselves in. It doesn't mean that everything is going to be set up and perfect. There's a lot of change management. That's usually what takes the most time, is organizations adjusting to the fact that they have these insights and they can do things in a different way than they had before. That probably takes 80% of the work, but you do have to kind of work and start that adjustment, get everything connected. And so, they range from, a week to, it can be a couple months, but it's, I think, very fast for this space, and it's something we continue to invest heavily. And our goal is to continue driving that down. I mean, we want to be that, we have at this point, I don't know the exact number, 300-400 of these connectors into these partners that will continue to grow. I'm sure over time there will be thousands, where a prospect can come to us and say, okay, these are the contract manufacturers I work with. These are my 3PLs. These are my retailers and distributors on my e-commerce platform. And we could say, you know what, we already have all those. We just need to kind of turn it on, and the data's flowing, and you've got that kind of system. It might not do exactly what you want on day one, but you have that end-to-end visibility that's really pretty turnkey, which is certainly possible to do.
Yeah, I mean, the more case studies, clients, and data sets that you're going to have, the more you're going to be able to do that. Yeah.
Right.
A good question another very good question that we got is from Aditya, and he was asking, what are the parameters that you're using as input to forecast the demand? Because demand in retail is dynamic and is forever changing, and then you have service levels, you need to have some buffers that you take into account. You have seasonality, you have out of stock or overstock. I mean, how do you? I mean, what are some of these parameters that you're kind of running through in the tool?
Sure. So I think the ones that tend to be the biggest predictors of future kind of performance, certainly it's going to be historical demand patterns are number one, assuming you have those. So looking at historical patterns of ideally that product, if it's a new product introduction, you're going to be looking at similar products, things within that category that you can use to give you that historical pattern of what does seasonality look like? What are kind of longer term trends that may be going on? You're also going to want to bring in all of the promotional data. So particularly in consumer goods, that's a huge shaper of demand. I need to know about historical promotions in significant events. That could be the Super Bowl or a holiday that's on different weekends. That's all information, by the way, we bring in automatically. So all of that kind of, school starts, this week in this region, all that's information we can bring in. You bring us your marketing calendar. We're collecting all of the historical demand. You can also bring in other external factors. They tend to usually be less powerful drivers, but I think they're things people often want to include. That can be macroeconomic factors, it could be things like weather. And all of those are basically thrown into, our platform. It's going to collect all those things dynamically. And then it starts running these models. And, the key way that I think one of the key things that we always explain with it is we use a lot of different methods. Some of them have been around for decades. I was talking about kind of coming from the more academic world, and these are methods that were discovered 50 years ago by statisticians. You can now do them at a scale that you never could historically with the computing power we have. Some of them are completely new. People talk a lot about machine learning and AI. Well, there's a lot of new methods. And the key thing is you kind of try all of them, and then you back test. You basically say, okay, I'm going to go see which of these using a portion of the data that we have historically have been predictive based on the whole data set that we have. And you can do that in an automated way. You can do it at scale. And so you can come out with things that give you a default forecast that's actually pretty accurate. And by the way, then you do ensemble forecasts that combine them together. So there's a lot of different techniques, but what we want to do is you bring all that together and you try to do it in a simple way. My experience is, companies, especially the larger ones, invest a lot in forecasting. Oftentimes that doesn't necessarily flow down to a lot of the individual work that's happening day to day. People are kind of running their own forecasts in Excel, which means they're usually pretty rudimentary and simple. There's advantages to simple forecasts too. But how can we expose and make that more readily available to the kind of the day-to-day users and consumers of this information? And so we really focus on making it, while they're very complex models, making them very simple in the way that they're applied, and so people can understand them and feel comfortable using them.
And I wanted to, because you say it's an artificially intelligence-driven tool, and unfortunately, I think it's unfortunately today AI as a term is overused and overutilized, and it is too much of a buzzword nowadays, right? So I wanted also to ask you, what do you understand by artificial intelligence? Because that's another thing that certain people understand different things through artificial intelligence. And how exactly are you using that or harnessing the power of artificial intelligence in Alloy?
Yeah, so the main way that it's used today is through forecasting. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of different machine learning techniques where, which is a type of artificial intelligence, if you will, that we utilize. The key thing is we don't just blindly use those techniques because they're the newest and they have the most sophisticated sounding name, right? It's you try those techniques. You also try more traditional statistical techniques. You use business logic, and then you try to figure out which one's actually the most predictive, because you or I shouldn't care about which method is used, whether it's a neural network or it's an ARIMA model. What I just care about is what is the most predictive thing for this product, in this channel or this account or an aggregate. And that's, I think, where Alloy uses machine learning in its toolkit, but we don't just blindly use it. We use it and we validate it, and we say, well, when we think it's the best technique, we should use it, and when it's not, let's use something else.
Makes sense. Let's talk a little bit, because you've seen a lot and you get to see a lot, because again, you're working with, across the field of, from really large companies to smaller startups, and so on, people that are just setting up. What do you see as common categories of inefficiencies that you come across? What's some of the commonalities? And I think you've touched upon some of them, right? You've touched upon silo mentality, maybe disparate type of forecasting, depending on, it can be on regions or products or so on. But I was just curious, are there some others, or where do you see the patterns of inefficiencies in supply chains?
So hopefully this will be an answer that suffices. But one thing I would say that we often find is a shortcoming, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is there is so much data out there. There's so much additional data that could be brought in, but probably most people aren't taking advantage of, that really a lot of, I'm sure many of the people that are listening's job is, how do I simplify that into, kind of key KPIs that I can track and understand, so that I can understand the health of my business. And that's a very good thing, because we do need to simplify, and you don't want to make things overly complicated. One of the real strengths, though, of computers is that they can process a lot of data at once. They're not always great at knowing exactly what to do with that information, but they can process a huge amount of information, and they can help you to pinpoint and be flagged where you can drill down at a deeper level from that KPI. So for example, I might want to look at something like on time and in full, right? A very common metric people are going to be looking at. And I am tracking that at a high level, and that number may feel just fine. But almost invariably, we see, as you drill in, you start to see patterns of where you're doing a good job, and within that maybe overall acceptable performance, there are real opportunities for improvement. And that's where I would say we often see a lot of the inefficiencies. And I think that aha moment we love here at Alloy is, people have kind of talked with us through their business. They might have an inkling that, hey, we think there's room for improvement, but how do you drill down below that high level number and start to see the detail, and then drill down again and drill down again? And ideally, how can you make it so, the platform's automatically telling you, okay, this is, if you look across that number, you're fine, but these are the routes where your OTIF is not so good. And there's dramatic room for improvement. And this is how much money is on the line and available if you can solve this problem. And so that's at least one area that we see, opportunity from, once again, the largest, most sophisticated customers out there and companies, down to the very early stage. Now, those opportunities, generally, people have squeezed out the efficiency as you get bigger and bigger, so they're better at it. But the numbers are also so much larger that the actual value of the pie is really massive. And so that would be kind of an area that I would say we see over and over again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I have asked you for an example, but I was thinking maybe we can take another one. If you have certain very data driven, like, okay, we took, maybe you can share with our audience, look, we took this client, and on this particular, we applied it to this particular data set or retail channel or whatever it is, and this is how much they saved, or this is how much more money they made. Because I am kind of trying to imagine it's almost like, I like what they can do. You go to the dentist, and it might look, when you look in the mirror, that your teeth are okay, right? But then the dentist looks a little bit deeper, right. Like, oh, well, you have a cavity here, right? And you should be fixing it, because otherwise it's going to spread. So I'd love to maybe get another example, because I think you must have quite a few of them, and see if you have some maybe some other client that you can share with us, and how you did it, and how much it kind of meant for their bottom line, or for their cost reduction, or whatever it was that it was achieved.
Sure. So let me share an example that probably follows in that last genre that I just shared with you, but is very specific, right, to make it feel a little more real. So we had a customer who was looking at in-stock levels. Again, you'll see that's a common pattern across our customer base. And they were looking at overall levels of inventory at this particular retailer. They had underperformed over an important period for them. And the challenge they were seeing is, it seemed as though they had sufficient inventory. They looked at the amount of inventory in this retailer. It was like, hey, it appears we have plenty. Why are we seeing out of stocks being so high? And why were sales not what we expected it to be? And the key thing is being able to break that out. And so you want to see every single distribution center at that retailer, and the fulfillment centers where they're fulfilling e-commerce. How much inventory is at each one? And what are all of the stores that they are supplying? And what are their inventory levels? And which ones are running out of stock? And what they were able to see is that there were some DCs that were running out of inventory and then couldn't replenish the stores. And there were others that had more than enough, right? So maybe in aggregate, the numbers seemed fine, but you had way too much inventory in certain locations and not enough in others. So those are the types of things where you can break down, okay, I see there's a problem. The aggregate number looks okay because I have sufficient inventory in aggregate, but it hasn't been correctly allocated. So they were able to go ping that retailer, say, hey, the replenishment, the way that we're allocating product is not correct. We need to reallocate in this way. And they were able to drive down those out of stocks and get the sales numbers to where they expected them to be.
Gotcha. Now I'm imagining in my mind another analogy with the zoom in, zoom out on the Google Maps, right? So it's kind of like giving the client that possibility to really drill down and see exactly what's going on. Where do you plan to expand next? You've raised quite some good funds. You're present already in 3 offices. What's next for Alloy?
So, we continue to invest really heavily in product development. There are so many, problems and, opportunities in this space. There's more data that we feel like we can bring in to have even better predictive models. Being able to link more and more of the supply chain. We've certainly started on the demand side of the equation, but have started to work with customers where we're linking their manufacturing plants with raw material suppliers, right? So we've gone and done that side of things too. So for us, you're investing in go-to-market and growing on that side, but really the bulk of the investment is in product development. So that's for us. Where kind of the bulk of the investment goes. And I think one of the really nice things about venture capital is you have investors who are aligned with saying there's a huge opportunity, there's many problems to be solved, and they have kind of share that long-term vision for what can be possible. And so we're doubling down there.
And I also like to, obviously, aside from the podcast, we're in the talent and human resources business. And I'm also passionate and curious in terms of talent and building cultures, and especially in startups and in younger companies like yourselves. And I know that you were sharing at some point that you're trying to maintain and you're building a very open and transparent culture in the company. And that kind of goes with your broader mission of sharing more information across the supply chain, and that's why you put a lot of emphasis in doing that internally. How does that practically translate? Like, how do you practically day-to-day do that in Alloy, and how do you also maintain a culture like that, an open culture like that?
Well, it starts with me being open with things. So, for example, we'll have a board meeting and we'll post, the deck from the board meeting and notes, and we share that with the entire company, right? Kind of unfiltered with all the information, the financials, the plan, you name it. And I think, one of the things you have to do as a leader is, trust that, the team will treat that responsibly. It's sensitive information. And people need to have a maturity to understand there's going to be good things that you're talking about. There's going to be things where you have to improve. And so, as you kind of think about the pros and the cons, well, everybody wants that openness, but you also have to have that, especially in a startup where things are changing all the time. And it's a bit of a roller coaster to say, hey, we trust you. And we're going to share this information in a pretty unfiltered way. But it's up to kind of each individual to, kind of be able to use that effectively and kind of use it to say, okay, I know there's, nothing's being hidden from me. I can be aware of the business goals and where we need to improve, and we're all in this together. So I think it's super powerful thing when done correctly, but you have to have a high level of trust on both sides about, what that means when you're sharing all this information.
Yes. And you were saying also in terms of, and this I found also fascinating, in terms of the type of skill set and kind of background of people that you have in the company, that you don't have a ton of supply chain experts. You do have people that have worked in supply chain, but primarily you have people that are really, really, really amazing technologists that know how to build scalable architecture, and very curious and want to learn. I wanted to ask you this question because sometimes there's a very, very fine balance in this, and the question, I'll try to frame it like this: how do you make sure that you're still building a solution that is very anchored in clients' problems? And I'll tell you what I mean by it. Sometimes, you also see that companies they start well, but then they start to lose track in some ways, or if you don't have that good balance between industry, knowledge, and technology, then you end up building a solution that doesn't fit the industry anymore, right? So how do you maintain that balance between having great programmers, great technology people, but at the same time making sure that it addresses and continues to address and evolve around the very significant problem that the industry faces?
As you said, it's a fine line, and it's one that we're always trying to balance, because it's obviously incredibly important that we understand the problem. And we certainly do have, supply chain people with the supply chain experience. We continue to hire there. But we want to make sure we can bring the best technologists to bear on the problem as well. I think throughout this, whether you have tons of industry expertise or you're coming in somewhat naive, is you have to be incredibly focused on the customers, right? That you have. They know their problems better than anyone. And so, for us, we learn so much from our customers. Now our goal is to, understand their workflows, understand their pain points. How could, what would they like the future to be? And then our job is to kind of come back and take all that knowledge, take the things that we know about the broader industry that we've learned from, our experience in building Alloy today, as well as all the things that we know technology can do, and then to start, coming up with ideas. And then you go through this iterative kind of testing process where you mock things up. You kind of, it is trial and error. That the best software is built through trial and error to some degree. It's this super iterative process of saying, okay, well, here's a couple ways we could solve that problem, right? I mean, what one resonates to you? And then maybe that starts with just paper mock-ups, and then you proceed to building a prototype, and you get to that point where, like, okay, we know we're addressing the problem. We have a good vision for what the solution is going to be like, and we're going to now fully invest in making it. But regardless of the level of expertise, I think companies succeed or fail based on how connected they are and how focused they are on serving their customers and solving their problems, because that's what they're paying you money to do. And so we get super laser focused on that. We probably have to do that even more, because we're coming at it with that kind of strong technology background. So that's how we tackle that problem and where we focus.
Mm-hmm. How about hiring? So, that's critical. It's, attracting new talent, attracting fresh blood, making sure that you get the brightest or the smartest. And obviously you started in Silicon Valley, where basically the fight, war, or whatever you want to call it, for talent is real, right? It's a jungle out there in terms of finding and getting the right people, because there's so many options for them. There's so many startups. Everybody's doing interesting things. What's some of your current priorities? How do you think about hiring? What's your challenges around hiring? Share a little bit about that with us.
Sure. So I think the priorities in hiring, you outlined some of the things that we're really looking for. We look for people that are intensely curious. And I think especially when you're at a startup and you're growing extremely quickly, our headcount is, I think, tripled, in the last year or so. You have to have people that are going to take a lot of ownership, and are going to be doing a lot of things that are going to be new for them, and are going to figure it out, right? They're going to do their best. Nobody does perfect. One of our values is iterate to excellence. This idea of, like, just start and get going, and the idea is that you're going to get better and better. The same way that you build products. So our priorities when we're looking for people is those that embrace the stage that we're at, like this very fast growing, lots of opportunities to learn and grow quickly. But you have to be able to operate in an environment where there's less predictability than there is going to be at a much larger company. I think in terms of, the challenges, it varies a little bit across our different offices. And as you said, Silicon Valley certainly, there's kind of a dogfight here for talent. One of the things we always have to focus on is how we differentiate. And the nice thing is we're tackling a problem that not a lot of companies in Silicon Valley are tackling. There's a lot of education that goes on around this incredibly huge space. And there's massive opportunity. And it's not that there's 10 startups on our street that are all trying to do the same problem. But you have to, help people get excited about it, see the vision, understand the opportunity, because, there's always other flashier consumer focused things that they understand probably more intuitively. And so that's something, we have to kind of continually do, is just, help them see it. I think you're already seeing this, by the way, in supply chain tech, particularly in logistics, where there's a lot of investment right now, where people are saying, whoa, there's this, quote unquote, unsexy space where there's just really interesting technical problems and a lot of data. And that's the kind of stuff that, engineers in particular get really excited about. They just need to know that it's there.
I was looking at the chart. I was looking at the chart recently that kind of outlined the venture capital and private equity investments in the space related to supply chain and logistics, and I think it tripled from last year. So in 2018, it was 3 times more than 2017. So it's definitely a very, very clear upward trend. And also we've seen, and this is not including some of the very large, we've seen some very large investments. Flexport is probably the very large one that was just funded about $1 billion from SoftBank, right? So there's definitely more and more interest. There's more and more money, in energy and funds being pumped, and it's also ripe for disruption, right? I mean, there's a lot of ways in which the whole system or supply chain can be done better, and it's great that people like yourself and other startups are looking at doing it. And yeah, when it comes to technology, people, as you said, you need to sell them the story, the data, but you know, it's that's key anyway, right? So
yeah.
And I wanted to also flip the question on the other side, because that's also useful for people that are listening to us, for maybe other founders or people that are thinking of setting up and hiring people. What are some of the mistakes that you made when it came to hiring so far, where it didn't work out?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that you see is, having kind of, I guess, been here from day one, different people work at different stages. And I think this is something, as you're starting a company, you're always trying to find those people who thrive at the stage that you're at, and hopefully in the stages to come. But I would say, if I look at the mistakes in hiring, it's oftentimes people that are extremely talented and have been very successful, often that, kind of the big brand name companies, but have difficulty transitioning to a company where there's much less infrastructure. And so I think that's something I focus a lot. You have to it's a balance, right? In the recruiting process and as you're interviewing, but trying to say, hey, is this the type of environment and the type of size where you might be coming in and being a team of one? You have to figure everything out on your own, and then you're going to set that foundation that's going to support other people who are going to come on. But you have to do that. And that's something a lot of people haven't done. And it can be really scary, and it doesn't work for everyone. So I would say, if I kind of, evaluate the times that it hasn't worked as well, it's oftentimes come back to just, we weren't the right size for the person that joined, even though in many cases, I'm sure they go on and have had a lot of success in other places.
This is quite common, and a lot of people think, and I've seen it a lot, and we see it a lot. I mean, and also it has become somewhat interesting or sexy for some reason, that it's to be part of a startup, right? But in actual fact, it's hard. And in actual fact, I mean, it's hard. One thing, it's also very interesting, but you gotta have the flexibility to adapt. And sometimes, if you've been in a corporate life all your career, it's not that straightforward to do that. So, and you're used to a certain system and a certain order and a certain structure. Startups are much more wild and dynamic, and things roller coaster, I think, is the word that you've used, and it's probably the closest to what it is, right? So you gotta have the nerve for that. Which is very, very tough, actually, to kind of spot in an interview a lot of times. So that's another thing. That's why also, I mean, I'm trying very hard as a headhunter. A lot of times, even for ourselves, we try to also deploy psychometric tools, and there's also all sorts of predictive analytics on human psychic and personality. But ultimately, I'm not sure there's a silver bullet in this. So
I was going to say, if you found one, I'm all ears, because that is it. I agree. It's a really hard thing to gauge. And I also will kind of double down on your point of, and I've seen this in the last 7 or 8 years, startups it's definitely become, people get excited about this idea of working at a startup, and I don't think they always fully recognize what that means. There are pros and cons. And so you're trying to educate. You're obviously, anytime you're recruiting, you're selling, you're trying to get them excited about the problem you're tackling, while also being realistic to say, hey, you've been working at Facebook and they're at a scale that's very different than we are. And you've had a level of support that you're not going to get here. And that is invigorating for some people, and it's terrifying for others. And people can change, but it's, it's an interesting balance that I'm sure you deal with a lot in your role too.
Yes. Where do you see in terms of skills? So obviously for you, in terms of hiring, it's very much going to be kind of keeping this balance and attracting very smart technology people, but also that have a strong customer centricity and understand the supply chain. But From a supply chain, from your client's perspective, I wanted to flip it a little bit and ask you from your clients, from the manufacturers, from the consumer goods, from the people working in the supply chain of these companies, where do you see the type of skills and people that they will need to be hiring more and more? Because also for them to best utilize your tool, and of course it's going to be, it's intuitive and it's simple to use, but there's also a level of I don't know, strategic thinking, be able to analyze data and all of that. So do you see there's also a shift in terms of your clients and what type of people they get in their supply chains?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. I don't think this is anything groundbreaking that I'm going to say here, but you compare the Eeros of the world. Eero is a customer of ours. They make Wi-Fi routers. They were recently purchased just, I think, a month or so ago by Amazon. Mm-hmm. And, they were founded just a couple blocks away from where we're based. You compare them with, once again, those kind of big, older CPG companies, and the skill set, the way that they think about data is just so different. I mean, these new digitally native kind of consumer brands, it is just, from the get-go, everything is going to be data-driven. I mean, they often come to us because they're just shocked that this is the way the industry operates. They're like, I had no idea when I started working with Walmart, this is the way that it works when you start selling through retail. And help me figure this out, because I just can't imagine operating a company where I don't have a pulse in the way that I have historically. And obviously every company is going through digital transformation. Every company understands the importance of analytics and using data to drive more decision making. That's nothing new and been discussed. But you see such a dramatic difference from the companies that are being founded, I think, more recently on the whole, with those that have a workforce that has an incredible amount of knowledge, but hasn't necessarily operated exactly in that way. And I think that trend is just going to accelerate. And you're going to see that, you're just going to see a much more data-driven or data mindful, kind of set of people. That doesn't mean everybody needs to be a statistician at all. It just needs to be like, hey, we make, a lot of decisions based on the data that we have. We combine that with the intuition and all the smart things that humans can do. I mean, the wonderful thing in all this is we're going to have a place in this future world, by the way. I mean, I certainly am confident in people, in our brains, in our ability to do a lot of things that computers are not good at. But we need to be super comfortable with offloading a lot of that work to computers, and so we can, augment them and do the higher value stuff. And I think you're going to see the most successful companies are adopting to that. You've already seen it happen in technology, and now it's happening across a lot of other industries, and supply chain is certainly going to be the same way.
I mean, that brought to my mind, I won't name the company, but it's a major consumer and appliances manufacturer. And they basically, I was talking to one of the C-level executives globally, and he was saying that they had bought a startup that was making some kitchen appliance. Anyways, I can't remember what it was, but anyways, it was very specific, but they had grown tremendously. So I think they bought them within 3 to 5 years of their kind of company life. And that manufacturing startup managed to grow to a global scale and distribute that particular piece of equipment for the kitchen with, I think it was 50 or 60 people, with almost everything outsourced. So they were doing, contract manufacturing, almost everything was outsourced. And they were basically just focusing on a very, very, I think the marketing was something that they were super, super strong at. And they had some patents in terms of the product, but that was it. So 50, 60 people, they went 3 to 5 years, I can't remember exactly. They went global, and they basically got this top global brand to buy them. And the company bought them because they wanted to learn from them how they could transform and integrate some of the principles that they were using to transform the bigger company in itself. So that's I found that fascinating, and it kind of goes well with your example as well, with the company that you just mentioned. So I could not agree more. We are this digital transformation. It's a buzzword. It's it's been going on forever, but it's really happening, right? It's how can you be faster, more agile, and more responsive to the market? And it's or if you don't, then well, you'll have some serious problems. Final question from our discussion. Joel, what's the best piece of advice that you've received throughout your entrepreneurial journey? Right. So entrepreneurship is hard, is exciting, is a roller coaster, is a tough and at the same time a wonderful experience. But what's some of the best pieces of advice and sharing you've received that could help other people that are thinking about it or on this journey?
Yeah. So I was actually thinking about this weekend randomly, and I'll share some advice that I received. It actually has nothing to do with entrepreneurship, but I think applies. The advice was actually given by my oldest sister before I had children. I have twin boys who are now 6 years old. Oh, wow. And so I was about to be, I guess this was, probably 6 or 7 years ago. I was kind of a nervous, expectant father, and was chatting with my sister who had a couple children. And she said, look, 90% of the time, kids are just a lot of work, and you're probably going to wonder why you did this. It's like, but then it's going to be 10% of the time when it's just amazing. It's transformational. You have these moments that make that other 90% feel like nothing. And I don't know why I was thinking about that this weekend, and I was like, you know what, that kind of sounds like being an entrepreneur. It's hard. It is, we've talked now multiple times about it being a roller coaster. Things can look externally like they're going amazing, and inside you feel like there's, it's chaos and so, a lot of it, and I think any entrepreneur will say this. I mean, you're just, kind of slogging it out in some sense day to day. But you have those 10% of times, right, where you look back and you see, you hear those amazing customer stories where a customer, CEO texts me and is like, oh my gosh, like you've changed the way that we operate. I got that text a couple months ago. And that's just so invigorating, and it makes you feel like you're doing something valuable. And it makes the whole thing worth it 10 times over. So for me, that's a way that, you kind of, sometimes, deal with the day-to-day and the struggles that everybody goes through in any job or any aspect of life. But, saying, hey, there are parts of this that make this, more than worth it. And those kind of tide me over for the tough periods that come as well.
Lovely. Excellent sharing. I never quite thought about it from that perspective, but yeah, very good. And I have 2 kids of my own, and probably 95% sometimes with kids. Like, oh my God, what did I do? And
my sister probably sandbagged the numbers to make it seem more palatable, but yes.
No, it's I don't know if we even can quantify kids, but it's very similar with startups. And that reminds me of a funny sharing, because I asked one other entrepreneur about this, and he's actually from Asia, and he started a last mile company in Asia, and his answer to this question, what's your advice? And then he was saying, don't get married. So don't get married, don't have kids, you don't have any time for that. So I like your sharing, because I think we bring balance. So I think you can make it no matter the stage, the time of our lives and your lives. But it's definitely, you should not, and nobody should think it's a ride in the park. That is for sure not. Joel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, for the great examples and sharings and real case studies. And I want to wish you and the Alloy team all the best, and keep growing, keep expanding, and keep getting us to read about you in the news.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to follow us on radopalamario.com/podcast for all the show notes, links, and extra tips covered in the interview. Make sure also to subscribe to our emailing list to get the news in the nick of time. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes or Stitcher and you like what we do, please kindly review and give us 5 stars so we can keep the energy flowing and get more people to find out about our podcast. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me to stay tuned for our latest articles as well as future guests for the podcast. And if you have any suggestions or any other idea, please feel free to write to me. I respond to all. And also, please make sure not to miss our next episode, where we will be having a few other C-level and top leaders in supply chain joining us. Stay tuned.